All right, okay, so now I introduced an idea that there are a whole lot of things, that there's a kind of sleight of hand, there's a kind of trick that human beings play where they count something that it isn't, so to speak, really. It's really just a piece of paper, but we count it as money. He's really just a guy, but we count him as the President of the United States. This is really just a piece of dirt, but I count it as my property. And I said there's a formula by which we do that, and the formula is X counts as Y, or X counts as Y in context C. And the philosopher's favorite is always games like chess. So such and such a position or move counts as a legal knight move, and such a position counts as white being in check, and such a check counts as checkmate, and checkmate counts as winning. Or if you watch football games, if you cross the goal line and while a play is in progress, when you're in possession of the ball, that counts as a touchdown. Touchdown counts as 6 points. The team that gets most points counts as the winner. There's all this counting as that goes on. And I maintained a strong, I made a strong claim, namely, well, that's the secret, or at least at one time it seemed to me. I'm going to modify it slightly, but it seemed to me that's a very powerful device, though it looks kind of feeble. Just, we agree to count something as something. It looks kind of feeble, but it has these two remarkable properties. Namely, it iterates upward indefinitely, so you have x1 counts as y1, but y1 equals x2, and that counts as y2. And if you've ever had a philosophy course, you know that's going to iterate upwards indefinitely, because y2 is going to be x3, which is going to count as y3. And the most obvious case of this is language. I make these noises through my mouth. They count as sentences of English, but uttering such and such sentences of English counts as, for example, making a promise. Making a promise in a certain context counts as undertaking a contract. And undertaking certain kinds of contracts counts as, for example, getting married. And in the state of California, if you get married, from the X points as Y point of view, all hell breaks loose, because you're now entitled to spousal benefits, pension rights, and all that other stuff. So this is quite a powerful device because it keeps going upward. Furthermore, it spreads out laterally. So in my case, I don't just have money. I have money in my bank account. It's in the Bank of America in the city of Berkeley. I use it to pay my credit card bills and my state and federal income taxes and a whole lot of other stuff. Now, all of that is X counts as Y spreading out in different directions. So it looks like it's not a feeble device because it's got these formal properties. On the other hand, why the hell should we put up with it? I mean, why do we put up with somebody claiming they're President of the United States or that this is money and so on? Well, that's a deeper question. We need to go into that. But now, if we're going to talk about this, we have to situate this X counts as Y in a larger context. And I want to say I make a distinction. Again, we're going to get more complicated, but for the simplest form, we make a distinction between brute facts, such as the fact that the Earth is 93 million miles from the Sun. The Earth and the Sun don't give a damn about us. That's how far apart they are. And that's versus institutional facts. And institutional facts depend on us because institutional facts are only facts because they're in human institutions, and the institutions exist in some sense by human agreement. So the San Francisco 49ers lost to the New Orleans Saints. That's an institutional fact. Barack Obama is President of the United States. That's another institutional fact. Institutional facts presuppose human institutions in a way that brute facts do not. So I own a piece of property on Yosemite Road in Berkeley. That is an institutional fact. That the Earth is 93 miles from the Sun is a brute fact. What's the difference? Institutional facts presuppose the existence of human institutions. An institutional fact can only exist within an institution. And what is an institution? An institution is a system of constitutive rules of this form. So we need to distinguish constitutive rules from regulative rules. Regulative rules regulate antecedently existing forms of behavior that doesn't require rules in order to exist. The philosopher's favorites are always rules of the road. Drive on the right-hand side of the road, drive on the left-hand side of the road. Driving exists independently of the rule. You can drive with either rule, and you can in fact drive without any rule, though it's much more dangerous. Whereas when it comes to institutional facts, you have to have rules, and the rules take this form. Regulative rules always take the form do act A, or in sometimes do act A in context C. Constitutive rules inevitably take the form X counts as Y. And as I told you last time, the favorite philosophers' examples of constitutive rules are always the rules of chess. In the case of driving, people had to get a convention. Which side are you going to drive on? In Britain, it was on the left. In other countries, mostly on the European continent here, we drive on the right. If you go back to the Middle Ages, there was some reason for it having to do with which side your sword was on and could you get it out in a hurry. And it'd be interesting to track that down. But in any case, the fact of riding a horse or driving doesn't require a rule. But in the case of the rules of chess, it wasn't like that. It was not the case that a lot of guys were pushing bits of wood around on boards, and some guys said, fellas, we got to get rules because your bishop keeps banging into my knight, and things are getting, all the pieces are getting chipped. That's not how it worked. You can't have chess without this system of rules. Indeed, playing chess is constituted by acting in accordance with at least a certain number of the rules. I don't think you have to have all of them. I never figured out the rule for taking a pawn en passant. I mean, chess players among you will find me incredibly ignorant, but I don't know how the hell that part. I got the castle rule. You can do it on the left or the right. It turns. Yeah, castling on the strong side is different from castling on the weak side. I'll explain it to you later. But that really is a fact about chess. But the pawn en passant, I leave that to the experts. But anyway, I can make the moves enough to play a game, even though I'm not especially good at it. Okay, that's the distinction between constitutive and regulative rules. Now here's the thesis. All of human institutional reality is created by systems of constitutive rules, because institutional facts, like the fact that Barack Obama is president, you're students in University of California, Berkeley, I'm a professor, this is Philosophy 138, we live in the state of California, I'm a property owner in Berkeley, my income taxes are overdue, man, how they're overdue, God, I don't even want to think about it. All of those are institutional facts, and all of those institutional facts exist only within systems like that. And indeed, if you look around you, you'll find you live in an absolute sea of institutional facts, almost all of which is invisible to you. And what I'm trying to do is make it visible. I was going to bring a copy of the New York Times and see how many institutional facts we could just dig off the front page. I'm sure it would be quite a lively number. But now we got to go a whole lot deeper. But that's our first claim. We'll see how far we can get with that. The first claim is that the human institutional reality, the reality of money, property, government, marriage, universities, cocktail parties, and summer vacations, that reality is a reality of institutional facts. Those institutional facts exist only within systems of constitutive rules. Constitutive rules invariably take this form, X counts as Y in C, though, of course, it's typically not put in that syntactical form. They don't say such and such counts as a legal knight move. What they say is the pawn can move forward unless it's taking another piece, in which case it can move diagonally, and that sort of thing. It just describes the actual possibilities. But the form of that, if you look closely, it's this form. Such and such counts as a legal move of the knight or the pawn or any other piece. Such and such an electoral situation counts as becoming the president-elect, and such an act on the president-elect counts as becoming president of the United States. Okay, so far so good. And it seemed to me we're off and running with a theory of institutional reality. Now you might say, well, okay, what's the big deal? So we count something as something it's not really. Well, all right, maybe you can con a lot of the people a lot of the time into going along with that, but why should they care? I mean, who gives a damn what you want to count as what? Well, then it turns out there's a whole lot of other apparatus that comes into play, namely, and this is why we spend so much time on it, collective intentionality. It isn't just that I count this stuff as money, but roughly speaking, everybody does. And when I go into the store, it's always, you ought to allow yourself to be amazed by what any sane person regards as too obvious to be worth mentioning, but philosophers by definition are amazed by the obvious. It ought to amaze you that people accept these sordid, filthy, unhygienic bits of paper for actual goods and services. I go into the store, and a semi-literate person on the other side will accept a filthy bit of paper for some object I really want, like a can of beer or something of some cultural significance. And they accept this filthy stuff. Why do they do it? Well, the answer is collective intentionality has imposed on it a status, and with that status, a function that can only be performed in virtue of the collective acceptance of that status. And guess what? Those are what I call status functions. So now we're getting closer to our target of explaining human civilization, and that is the distinctive feature of human civilization. The basic way we differ from animals is that we have status functions. All of you occupy a large number of different status roles, and with those status roles, functions that can only be performed with the exceptions of the status and the corresponding role. In my case, I'm a licensed driver in the state of California. I'm a professor in the university, an American citizen, and as such, I possess certain status indicators. I possess a California driver's license, and believe me, it's very hard to live in this state without it. I have a status indicator, and I also, in addition to a driver's license, I have a passport. And the initial role of these things is epistemic. You wave this around, and people will agree that you are a licensed, I don't know why I'm anxious to show off this dumb thing, but here it is. Will agree that you are a licensed driver, and you can get all sorts of things with this that you can't get without it. For example, people will believe that you're really old enough. I mean, nowadays they believe that I can buy a beer even without a driver's license, but there was a period in my life when they wanted to see something like that, and in your case they probably still do. So you have status indicators that initially have a function which is epistemic. Their purpose is to enable people to know that you occupy the status. Now later on they get a kind of life of their own, and that's going to be very interesting to us. It turns out that there are some societies where capitalism did not take off, even though they're no poorer than the next door societies. Now, a main reason they didn't take off is that they don't have status indicators of the right kind. And a guy wrote a book about this. His name is Hernando de Soto. And he wrote a book asking why capitalism works in some countries and not others. And he says the reason, for example, it doesn't work in Egypt is they don't have status indicators. They don't have property deeds for the property. Legally speaking, the property owners are squatters. They live on the land. They occupy the land. Everybody recognizes that they have a right to the land, but they don't have a title deed to the land. Now, because they don't have a title deed to the land, they can't take out a loan. They can't go to the bank and get a loan on the land, and the government can't tax them. So they have a de facto institutional fact, but it's not de jure. In the absence of a de jure institutional fact, they do not have a status indicator, a property deed. Without the status indicator, they can't get a loan, and the government can't tax them. And, says DeSoto, almost all small businesses start with a loan on private property. You own a house, you go and get a loan from the bank, and you open your software firm or whatever you want to do, and they don't do that in Egypt. So they have enormous resources that are, so to speak, useless from a capitalist point of view because they do not constitute capital. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this point. I just mentioned this by way of a footnote. Status functions typically require status indicators. The status indicator's primary function is epistemic, but later on it gets a life of its own, so that the status indicator exists also as a kind of status function. You can do things with a driver's license that you can't do just by being a licensed driver. One of the marks of creeping totalitarianism is that you're constantly being asked to present identification. You're constantly being forced to prove that you really are who you say you are, and things like that. I look back to my childhood days on my summers in Wyoming when there were no such things as driver's license, and I got a driver's license when I was 14. I lied about my age a little bit, but you got a driver's license by mailing $1 to Cheyenne. I mailed my $1, and they mailed me back a driver's license, and I used that driver's license, well, really, till I moved to California 15 years later. So I parlayed that license into other licenses around the country. Here's my Wyoming license, give me a Wisconsin license. They did. However, totalitarianism is now spread so that you can't do that anymore. Filling out of forms is the first step in totalitarianism. We'll get to that. Okay, but in any case, I don't want to get distracted on status indicators. I want you to see you don't wear your status on your face. You have to have status indicators, and status indicators initially are epistemic. Now, it's interesting in a class system. When I was a kid in Oxford, you could tell immediately somebody's class status by the way they dressed and by their accent. So it was not necessary to lock the doors of any college rooms because the college servants would immediately have recognized someone coming in who was not an appropriate person to enter the college. People entering the college with a tweed jacket, a college tie, and speaking, well, I won't say with a Christchurch accent, but at least a Balliol accent would be accepted in the college. But if somebody came in wearing filthy blue jeans and speaking with a working class accent, that would have been, the college servants would have taken care of him immediately, politely, but they would have taken care of him immediately. Then a terrible thing happened. It's called democratization. Everybody started wearing blue jeans. And people started imitating the speech of some dreadful rock and roll group. So you could no longer tell who people were just by speaking to them. And then people had to start locking their doors. And it was the end of civilization as we know it. But again, I'll come back to these more subtle points later. Now we're just with status indicators of the form X counts as Y. And let's pause for questions, because now I'm going to expand on this. This, I think, is the simplest version of institutional reality. Institutional reality consists of institutional facts. These exist within systems of constitutive rules. The constitutive rules take that form, and they work by collective intentionality, specifically collective acceptance or recognition. We'll come to that distinction later. Okay, I saw two hands up. First you, and then you. Yeah, at the back.
Would you consider evolution to be a brute fact, or
which? Evolution is a brute fact. It is a fact about a human species, a human and animal species, that they have evolved. Now, typically, however, within the brute fact of human evolution, there are a great deal of observer relative facts, such as that such and such an organ or such and such a phenotypical feature of the organism is functional. And as I told you, functions are always observer relative. So what is going to turn out is that this distinction between the brute and the institutional has to be absorbed into a much larger distinction between brute facts that are observer independent, and then all sorts of intentional facts that are observer relative, of which institutional facts are a subclass. But the short answer to your question, evolution is a matter of brute facts. Some animals evolve and survive and others don't. It's got nothing to do with votes or recognition or status functions. Okay, now you had a question, and then there was somebody else. You're next.
Would you say that human institutional reality, you say that is synonymous with society?
Society? No. You can have animal societies. I'm glad you asked the question because it enables me to clarify an important point. As far as the account I gave in the construction is concerned, a social fact consists of collective intentionality shared by any two or more animals. So a pack of dogs has a social reality. They have social facts because they have collective intentionality. And indeed, when I go for a walk with my dog, it's clear that it's collective intentionality. It isn't just that I'm going for a walk and he's going for a walk. We go for a walk together, and when it gets to be walk time, he lets you know. You better get the leash. And when he sees it, he's delighted. In fact, he'll shut up if you put the leash on him, even when we're in the house. That's collective intentionality. Because he knows we're going to cooperate in going for a walk. But that's not institutional. Now, what's the difference? Well, I haven't got to that yet. But the point is, why doesn't it count as a walk? I'll get to that. I haven't got there yet. But do you want to say some more about that? Yeah.
Can you just define society?
Yeah. For our purposes, a society consists of people who think that they share a certain kind of collective intentionality. So roughly speaking, you're in a society if you and other people think you are. So if you're a Boy Scout and you share collective intentionality with the other Boy Scouts, then you're a subgroup within the larger American society. If you're an American and you think you're American and you think that's a big deal, then you're part of American society. And as I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to say more about it later, is an amazing fact that the nation state has become the focus of the highest loyalty that people have, more important even than religion for very large numbers of people, in the sense that people have been willing to go out and die by the hundreds of thousands for France or Germany or England in a way that they wouldn't die for the Baptist Church. Not even Congregationalists. No, especially not Congregationalists, I would say. So now what's going on here? After the great wars of religion, we had these absurd wars of nationalism. And why should the nation state be the focus of the most important loyalty? I have much closer dealings with Alameda County than I do with the federal government. But all the same, nobody's going to suggest that I ought to be drafted and be willing to die for Alameda County. It's just not going to happen. Nobody cares about Alameda County that much. In a way, they do care about the United States of America or other nation states. Why? What's going on? Well, we haven't got there yet. I haven't given you enough tools to think about that yet. We'll come there. I saw our other hand up. Yes?
Status indicators don't seem necessary for status functions.
They are not, but they are necessary for status functions to work efficiently, because you got to have some way of knowing if the person or the object has the status that is claimed. There's an advantage to falsely claiming that you have a status. You can claim that you're an American citizen even when you're not an American citizen, and there are all sorts of problems that arise from that. They're called undocumented. By the way, watch euphemisms. Undocumented is a euphemism for illegal. It's a crime to enter the country illegally. It isn't that, I left my passport and my wallet or something. I left it at home. It's not. I'm right now undocumented. I don't have any documents that prove that I'm in the United States legally. But when people say undocumented, that's a euphemism. They mean illegal or criminal. But anyway, we'll get back to that later. It's important in institutional reality that there's some things you don't, that it's impolite or not considered politically correct to say explicitly. You have to disguise it in various ways. Okay, other question? Yes?
So, I can impose a status on any object, and it would be a status function, but it's only if that
You got to get people to accept it.
Yeah, if it were collectively recognized.
Yes.
Then it would have real, causal efficacy.
Yes.
Significance.
Yeah, let me... lest you think, well, hell, let's go out and create a whole lot of institutional facts by imposing status functions on objects. you have a problem. You have to get people to accept it. And sometimes that can be done outside of an institution. The single most famous case was the Declaration of Independence of the United States, because what happened was a group of middle-aged men in Philadelphia, which is, after all, a city in a British crown colony, and every one of these people was a subject, not a citizen, but a subject of the British monarch, King George III. And they all got together and by collective intentionality simply announced, we are a separate country. We have declared ourselves to be a separate status function, a separate nation, when in the course of human events, and so on. They go on. And it's a terrific piece of chutzpah, but they got it to work. They got it to work because they got people to accept it. People accept it. Yes, there is the United States. Now, it's true. In order to get people to accept it, they had to have a long and protracted war, and they had to get an army to fight for them. But the army, after all, is another system of status functions, as General Washington would be the first person to be aware of. He occupied a status within the army, and also they couldn't have done it by themselves. They needed help from the French, something you don't hear Americans remark on much in recent years, that without the help of France, there'd be no United States of America. I mean, without the United States of America, there'd be no France either. That's twice we pulled them out of the fire in the 20th century. But in any case, I don't want to get into the niceties of politics, but it is an interesting fact that you can create very important institutional facts outside of institutions just by getting people to agree to do it. Now, it doesn't always work. Inspired by Philadelphia, a bunch of similarly situated men in Richmond decided that they would declare themselves to be an independent country, the Confederate States of America. It didn't work. It took a long time. I have some Confederate money. It's quite interesting to read what it says on it. It says they'll pay you in real money after the war is over. But it didn't happen. I mean, they lost the war. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I want you to see the complexity of the phenomenon. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to get a simple account that will account for nation states, poker games, love affairs, cocktail parties, universities, and massive international wars. Okay, so we've got to have an account that covers all of that. Why? Well, basically because I think human beings aren't smart enough to have a whole lot of different devices. They only have a rather limited number of devices for creating institutional reality. Just as with a limited number of sentence forms, they can create all of the complexities of human discourse. Okay, any other questions now? Because now I'm going to go on. Now I'm going to develop this in much broader canvas. Yes?
What's an example of an institutional fact that's not a status function?
Yes. I thought there were institutional facts that were not status functions when I wrote the construction, and I gave, the problem, I haven't given you all the tools yet, but the idea is this. When you have a status function, you have a certain kind of power. And you, because you're a professor or a student or a citizen, you have a certain kind of power that you would not have otherwise. Now, what kind of power is that? It's not physical power. Well, it is the power that goes with rights, duties, obligations, authorizations, permissions, etc. This whole thing, which I call deontic powers. Now, there are institutional facts, or so I said, which don't carry any deontic powers. If you win the title of Miss Alameda County, I hope it still exists, the annual beauty contest for my beloved Alameda County. If you win the title of Miss Alameda County, I don't think you get any power at all. They probably give you a bouquet or something like that, maybe a free dinner, but you don't get any power that goes with it, or so I said. And about the time I was working on this, I got an honorary degree from a university in Italy, and it occurred to me afterwards that with this greatest status function I got, I'm now an honorary doctor of the University of Torino, I can't even get a cappuccino. I mean, you have no power that goes with the honorary degree. But when I wrote the Making the Social World, I decided, what the hell, let's treat these as limiting cases. Let's treat all status functions as carrying deontic powers, even if the power is purely honorific. Is that a kind of power? Well, there's a Mickey Mouse answer to that, and it says yes. You have the right to the honor that goes with being a doctorate, or having a doctorate, or being Miss Alameda County. So I don't much care. It's a terminological point, but I get a more elegant theory if I have the following set of equivalences. All institutional facts are status functions, and all status functions carry deontic powers. Sometimes the deontic power is negative. It happens to me more often than I like to admit that I sometimes go out and find a yellow piece of paper on my car windshield. That is called a parking ticket. It is a negative deontic power. I now have the obligation, not the positive power, but an obligation is a negative power, the obligation to pay an absurd amount of money to the city of Berkeley for a parking fine. So powers can be both positive, as when I have the right, and they can be negative as when I have the obligation. Right now, I'm trying some months late to figure out my income tax, and that is a negative power. I have the obligation to pay the state and the feds what seems to me like a lot of money, but I don't know why they care so much, because they got lots more than I do anyway. But anyway, if you don't face income tax yet, you will. You all have that, years and years of that to look forward to. Okay, but that's a short answer to your question. I'm going to go into more detail about that. So, terminologically, I get a more elegant theory if I treat all institutional facts as status functions. All status functions carry deontic power. Indeed, the simplest test for whether or not something is an honest-to-John status function is there a deontology that goes with it? Do you get a deontic power? Yes, Jennifer.
I'm curious about what you said about the relationship between accumulating status indicators and totalitarianism.
Yeah.
Is the relationship that the more status indicators that you have, the more your behavior is bound?
Not necessarily, no. The idea was this, that in a regulated society, you're epistemically constrained. Everything about you is known. Big Brother is watching. And every move you make has to be authorized. You're not allowed to do this without an authorization. You're not allowed to enter the building without showing your pass. You're not allowed to use the fax machine without the card to stick in the machine. So you have this constant constraint that goes with the epistemic web in which you find yourself when every fact about you is known, and which you constantly have to prove your authorization to do anything. Now, those of you who did not live in Wyoming in 1947 won't know what freedom is like. You went where you wanted to go. Nobody asked you for a driver's license, because there wasn't any such thing as a driver's license. It's true there were sort of hunting licenses, but I never knew anybody who got penalized for shooting a deer out of season. On the contrary, my uncle was deputy sheriff, and we used to go out and shoot deer whenever we felt like it. I mean, this was Wyoming. This was if you want to know why people get conservative as they get older, it's because they can see what they regarded as things they took for granted about civilization simply disappearing before their eyes. To name something closer to home, for the first 10 years I lived in Berkeley, I never locked my front door. Didn't need to. My wife didn't even own a key to the house. In fact, when we went away on vacation to Mexico, we used to fumble around and see if we couldn't find a key to the house. Shouldn't we lock the house before we go to Mexico City? And so we would lock the house and go away for some weeks and then come back. Now, we have burglar alarms. Everything is locked. We never leave for weeks at a time without having a house sitter who looks after everything and so on. So this is a decline in a standard of living which is quite invisible. You grew up where you take it for granted that you have to lock doors. But again, to repeat, for the first 10 years I lived in Berkeley, I never locked the door, and there was no crime at all. No thievery at all, except one instance that really annoyed me, and that is once I went to the office and a terrible rainstorm came up, and when I went back to my car, I found somebody had removed my umbrella. I never locked the car either. You know, why? I mean, but some dreadful person, I hope, long since struck dead by God, took my umbrella out of my car. Nowadays, of course, I have automatic electronic locks that make a beeping noise and so on. From half a block away, I can lock and unlock the car. All right, I'm getting ahead of myself. But anyway, all these are good questions. Now let's go to the next step. Okay, I haven't told you about the role of language. Language is very special. Now, what I've said is something that I'm pretty sure is false or at least misleading, and that is, it looks like, on the account I've given you, linguistic facts are institutional facts like any other. So the fact that I made a statement, and the fact that I voted in an election, and the fact that I'm a professor are all institutional facts. It's all one fact is the same as another, and it looks like that is so. Barack Obama counts as president of the United States because he satisfies certain conditions. And the utterance of the sentence, snow is white, counts as making the statement, snow is white, because it satisfies certain conditions, meaningful sentence of English, and so on. So it looks like linguistic facts are institutional facts, same as any other institutional facts. Now, when I wrote my first book, Speech Acts, I thought that was right, that the way to understand language was to see it as systems of constitutive rules on analogy with games. And speaking, this is a view I shared with Wittgenstein and Austin and a whole lot of other important thinkers, that speaking a language is like playing a game. You have a set of rules. These rules are constitutive, and just as the rules tell you how to move your knight or your bishop, so the rules of English and other natural languages tell you how to make a promise or a statement or ask a question. Now, it's not a stupid view, but it is profoundly mistaken in that it fails to recognize the primacy of language. Intuitively, we feel you could have a society that had language but didn't have money, property, government, or marriage, but you couldn't have a society that had money, property, government, and marriage but didn't have a language. Why not? Why can't the animals all get together and decide to have a private property and money and marriage? Why do they have to have a language? Well, that's a deep question. We're going to get to it. And we're misled by the fact, I've mentioned before, animals do have status hierarchies. They don't have status functions, but they do have alpha males and alpha females. But those are brute facts and not institutional facts. Or rather, we're going to need to make this richer. They're intentional facts because they involve intentionality. But we'll get to that. Okay. Anyway, this is our theory so far. This is the theory that I spelled out when I wrote the construction of social reality. But there were some interesting problems with the construction that eventually led me to write another book, The Making of the Social, what do I call it? Making of Society. What's the damn? Making the Social World, right. The idea is that the title should mean the same but sound different. Okay, now, and I realized this when I wrote that second book, and here are some of the problems. Number one, I said all institutional facts exist within systems of constitutive rules, but I gave counterexamples to that. A tribe might just decide to treat a line of stones as the boundary. They decide to treat this line of stones as the boundary. This line of stones, X, counts as the boundary, even though there's no rule, no system of rules that enables that to be the boundary. Or a bunch of kids might just treat a certain member of the softball team as the captain of the team, even though there was no system of constitutive rules by which he or she was elected. They just decide to treat that person as the captain. So you can have institutional facts without constitutive rules. But furthermore, you can sometimes have institutional facts without an X term. What various people pointed this out to me, and one of them, Barry Smith, called this freestanding Y terms, where you have the Y status function, but there isn't any X, which is the Y status function. Look up the law for creating corporations in the state of California, and you'll find you don't need an entity at all. The corporation exists because you say it exists. The corporation, I'll bring the law and read it to you. It's in Making the Social World. But what the law is very interesting. It says the corporation comes into existence when you file articles of incorporation. Well, what's that? Why is filing articles of corporation the device for creating an institutional reality? It isn't that there is a building or person or set of persons that constitutes the corporation. No, the corporation doesn't weigh anything. It has no physical existence. Does everybody see that? The corporation, for this reason, it's called a fictitious person in the law because it's treated as if it were a person, even though there is no actual person. So what's going on in that case? You have such and such counts as the corporation, except there is no such and such. It's just you made a corporation, period. End of the story. And doesn't that go against my view that institutional reality has to bottom out in brute reality? Because at bottom, the world is made of physical particles. But what is General Motors made of? Or General Motors barely exists. I guess it's coming back into existence. But let's take IBM or Intel. I guess they exist. Or Google. Or worse yet, what's it called? Facebook. I don't know if it's a corporation yet. It will be if it isn't. Okay, so you have all these corporations that have no physical reality at all. And reflection on that leads to the following thought. Here's an irony. My favorite example of imposing a status function was money, where we impose a status function on bits of paper or pieces of metal. But in fact, most of your money has no physical reality at all. There are magnetic traces on computer disks, but the magnetic trace isn't money. What is it? Well, now watch this carefully. It's a representation of money. The bank consults the magnetic trace and tells you that you still have $75 left in the bank. But the $75 is nowhere realized physically. Each of us likes to think, I think it's part of our mythology, that surely there must be a drawer in the bank with my name on it where they keep my money, and I ought to be able to go and have a look at my money. There is no such drawer, and there's no amount of money. The amount of money is totally insufficient to pay, and the amount of cash that they actually have is totally insufficient to pay all of the depositors. Even the amount of money they have abstractly in bank accounts and reserves and so on is insufficient. So most money is not in the form of an X on which the Y status function is imposed. On the contrary, most money has no physical existence at all. There's a representation of the amount of money you have, but the representation is not itself the money. Now, what's going on? We need to probe that. So we got two difficulties with this account. One difficulty is that you sometimes don't need a rule. You can just ad hoc count this person as the captain of the team, or that line of stones as the boundary of the territory. But a second puzzling case is you can get rid of the X term for some kinds of institutional facts and just have the Y status function. You just create a corporation or money. All right, another difficulty is that it seems to be a consequence of the account given in the construction that there can't be any surprises in the social sciences because social reality exists only because people think it exists. But this depressed a lot of people in sociology and anthropology, and they expressed outrage because they said, on the contrary, we make important discoveries in the social sciences, such as, for example, the country's in a recession. And it can be in a recession even if nobody thinks it's in a recession. And I agree with that. I think all that's very neat. Okay, now I had an answer to all of these objections, and that is that really the institutional reality does bottom out in actual people, in actual facts. So it's true that you don't need an object to count as the corporation or a person to count as a corporation, and you don't need an object to count as money. But all the same, there has to be somebody who's the owner of the money, the possessor of the money. And in the corporation, there has to be a board of directors, and there has to be a set of officers and stockholders. So it does bottom out in actual human beings. There has to be actual people. And in the other case, I pointed out that there are lots of systematic fallouts of institutional facts, which are not really themselves institutional facts, but are consequences of institutional facts. So that the country is in a recession is not itself an institutional fact, but it is a consequence. It's a fallout. It's an effect of a whole lot of other institutional facts. Nowadays, a recession is defined as a decline in the gross domestic product for what is it, 2 quarters or more, or I forget what is it 2 quarters is enough for a recession? Okay, so that's the definition of a recession. But so far, that's not an institutional fact. Why not? It carries no deontic powers. It's just a fact that we observe about the economy, and it is a systematic consequence of a lot of institutional facts, such as people are buying and selling and being paid, and there is a growth or a decline in the actual amount of goods and services bought and sold. Okay, so there are the objections and there are the answers. However, I want to go the next step. I want to say we ought to ask the question we have not so far asked, and that is we ought to ask, what kind of a speech act is counting something as something that it isn't intrinsically? What sort of a speech act is that? You see, the Speech Act for regulative rules is pretty clear. It's a directive. It's an order. The criminal law consists of a set of standing orders. Thou shalt not exceed the speed limit, for example, and if you violate those directives, then you are penalized accordingly. But the law for the creation of corporations, what kind of a speech act is that? Now, I should have seen this a long time ago, but it took me a long time to see it. But that's the next state. I want to now talk about the special role of language. We have plenty of time. In the constitution of institutional reality. Now, we've said our aim is to show how human civilization is a consequence, and I would say in the long run, it's kind of an inevitable consequence of much more fundamental facts about physics, chemistry, and biology. And in particular, we've seen that you have intentionality and collective intentionality. Now, when you have intentionality and you have complex systems of collective intentionality, some species, by no means all, but a very few species, have developed a very peculiar phenomenon, namely meaning. The species are able to make noises or gestures that have meaning. In the case of the bees, the female bee comes back to the hive and she does what's called a waggle dance. And the various features of the waggle dance are meaningful to her female conspecifics. They can tell, they get information from the waggle dance about the source and distance and difficulty of attaining the nectar that they can then use to make honey. And that looks like it has a lot of the features of a language. Okay, now what is it that makes that meaningful? Well, to put it in one sentence, if this were a course in the philosophy of language, I'd spend several lectures on this, but to put it in one sentence, what happens is, in those cases, you have an intentional act, and the intention behind that act has conditions of satisfaction. You make a gesture or a movement. But what is special about meaning is that the movement itself now acquires conditions of satisfaction. So there's a distinction between raising your arm, just to be raising your arm, and raising your arm to signal somebody. What's the difference? Well, let's take a case where we imagine people actually have a language, and imagine the difference between saying something and meaning it, and not saying it without meaning anything. If to practice French pronunciation, I say over and over, il pleut, il pleut, il pleut, I don't mean anything. I'm just trying to say the words correctly. But if somebody asks me, what's the weather like, and it's a French person, and I say, il pleut, then there's a dramatic shift. Now I mean that it's raining. What's the difference between saying it without meaning it and saying it with meaning it? Wittgenstein always asks us questions like that to get us to see that meaning doesn't name a mental process. It isn't some mental buzz that goes with me, with my saying something when I talk. All the same, there is a difference. What's the difference? Well, the difference is this. When I just said il pleut and didn't mean it, I still performed an intentional action. And that intention in action had conditions of satisfaction. The condition of satisfaction is that I should correctly produce a French sentence, a particular French sentence. I should pronounce it. But when I say il pleut and mean that it's raining, then my meaning that it's raining consists in imposing conditions of satisfaction, namely truth conditions, on that utterance. So for those of you who like swift summaries, the secret of meaning is the intentional imposition of conditions of satisfaction on conditions of satisfaction. There's a double level of intentionality in the Speech Act. Now let me go through that very carefully, because if you understand this, you'll understand an awful lot that a lot of professional philosophers don't understand. When I say il pleut, and I say it intentionally, and I'm trying to succeed in pronouncing it correctly, I will have succeeded if my intention and action produces the conditions of satisfaction, produces the sounds. But to say it and mean it is to intend not only to produce those conditions of satisfaction, but to intend that the conditions of satisfaction themselves have further conditions of satisfaction. In this case, truth conditions. So the condition of satisfaction of saying il pleut and meaning il pleut are an addition to just saying il pleut. By saying il pleut, the conditions of satisfaction are just you say it right. That's hard enough. But the condition of satisfaction of saying it and meaning it is that the utterance itself should have truth conditions. It should be true or false, as the case might be, and you're committed to its truth when you say it and mean it. So what happens when you make a gesture or a sound or write marks on a paper, if you mean something by them, then what you intend is that the production of those sounds, marks, or gestures should themselves have conditions of satisfaction. Meaning, in the sense of speaker meaning, consists in the intentional imposition of conditions of satisfaction on conditions of satisfaction. That sounds like a big deal, but you do it every day. And it needn't be something hyper-intellectual. The coach goes to the blackboard and says, now look, you idiots, when we ran that pass play last night, and the front four were lined up like this, and we were lined up like this, with the wide receivers out here, and this wide receiver went that way, and that one went that way. Well, that was no help at all, because the pass was supposed to go that way, you see. Now notice, it's just a bunch of marks on a blackboard. What makes it meaningful? Well, what makes it meaningful is there's a sort of convention by which these stand for the offensive team, and the X's stand for the defense. I'm out of date. Maybe they've changed the convention by now, but I think that's how it goes. The X's and O's stand for football players. And what we've done is we've imposed conditions of satisfaction. This is supposed to represent how a play is supposed to go on or how it could go on. So there needn't be anything specially hyper-intellectual about the imposition of meaning on marks and sounds and symbols. We do it all the time. But that's what happens when you create a speech act, is you create a second level of intentionality whereby your utterance now has truth conditions in the case of statements, obedience conditions in the case of orders, fulfillment conditions in the case of promises, and so on. Everybody's got that. All right, now we're still asking the question, yeah, all right, but what about this X counts as Y and C? What kind of a speech act is that? Well, we saw in our discussion of intentionality that if you have an intentional state that looks like this, typically those have one of two directions of fit. In the case of belief, they have the mind to world direction of fit, and in the case of desires and intention, they have the world to mind direction of fit. In the case of the belief, the mental state in the form of the belief is supposed to match the world. If it does, it's true. If it doesn't, it's false. In the case of desires and intentions, the world is supposed to change to match the content of the mind. And if you do get that fit, if you do get the world to mind direction of fit, then you don't say the desire was true or the intention was true, you say the desire was fulfilled or satisfied, and you say the intention was carried out. And you remember I said the secret of understanding all this is conditions of satisfaction. Now, we also found that there were emotions where you presuppose a fit, and those are things like pride and shame and joy and sadness, where you presuppose that something has happened and you're proud of it or ashamed of it, joyful or sad about it. But it looks like it's a sort of a neat system, because even these also have conditions of satisfaction, because pride and shame, joy and sorrow contain beliefs and desires, and those do have a direction of fit, uphill or downhill. So we got a kind of nice, simple version of intentionality as being analyzable in terms of the conditions of satisfaction presented in a psychological mode with one or the other directions of fit. Everybody's up with this. Okay. Now, when you have language, all of this maps beautifully onto language, because corresponding to beliefs with this direction of fit are assertive speech acts, such as statements, assertions, explanations, clarifications, and descriptions. All of those have this direction of fit, where you represent how things are, and I'll use Frege's assertion sign, and every assertion, every assertive, such as a statement or a description, is an expression of a belief. You get a map, you get a correspondence between the SP, which marks a type of state, and the FP, which marks a speech act as an utterance that has a certain force. Now, I don't want to go too fast, so I want you to understand all this. Mental states consist in contents in a certain psychological mode. Beliefs, desires, hopes, fears, love, hate, etc. They consist in contents in modes. But when you learn to impose conditions of satisfaction on conditions of satisfaction, you get these things, which are acts. They're not states. These are speech acts, and they have the same type of content. Both the belief that it's raining and the assertion that it's raining have the same content. In one case, it's believed. In the other case, there's an actual speech act. The way you get from the psychological state to the meaningful speech act is by way of meaning, and meaning consists in imposing these conditions of satisfaction on the utterance that constitutes the performance of the speech act. That's what I meant when I said meaning consists of the intentional imposition of conditions of satisfaction on conditions of satisfaction. So corresponding to beliefs, you have assertives. Corresponding to desires, you have directives, such as orders, commands, requests, suggestions. In one sense, a suggestion where you're trying to get the hearer to do something. And in all of these cases, you have a desire that the hearer does something. H does A as the content of the directive. And I use the shriek mark to mark the type of speech act that it is. In the case of promises of the intention, in the case of promises, as in the case of orders and requests, you have the uphill direction of fit. And I call these, and this is a term I got from Austin, I call these commissives. And in the case of the commissives, you have, let's just use C as the abbreviation, you have the uphill direction of fit, and the psychological state is always an intention, and the propositional content is always that the speaker, not the future, not the hearer, does some future course of action A. Okay, the favorite case of the commissive is the promise, and the favorite case of directives are orders and commands. Now, I'm going through this fast, but I want you to see it. There are three big classes of speech acts corresponding to the two directions of fit. You have the assertives that correspond to the downhill or mind-to-world direction of fit. And the mark of this direction of fit is, can it be true or false? If it can literally be true or false, then it's likely to be an assertive. But not all speech acts are assertions. Some are orders and commands, and others are promises, vows, pledges, threats, contracts, and guarantees. The order-command category, orders, commands, requests, suggestions, I call directives. The other class that involve intentions, I call commissives, and the philosopher's favorite is the promise. Okay, now corresponding to these emotions over here, where you presuppose the fit, we also have a class of speech acts that I call expressives. And the point of the expressive is simply to express the psychological state in the sincerity condition. And expressive includes such things as thanking, congratulating, apologizing, welcoming, condoling. In every one of those, you express a psychological state, such as sorrow in the case of condolences, or regret in the case of apologies, or gratitude in the case of thanking. You express a psychological state where you take the propositional content for granted. So I'll use E for the expressive, and we have this perp for presuppose fit. And then you have a variety of states, so I'll put that in brackets. Gladness, sorrow, happiness, all of those can be the content of expressives, of thanking, congratulating, and so on. And then in the case of the expressive, you have usually something to do with either the speaker or the hearer, plus some propositional content about the speaker or the hearer. So I can congratulate you on the fact that you won the race. I can congratulate you on the fact that your son won the race, but I can't really congratulate you on the fact that the square of 25 is 625. The square of 25 is 625, congratulations. That won't do. You've got to have some connection with you. It has to have something to do with the speaker or the hearer. Okay, so you got these four kinds of speech acts, and they map pretty well onto our theory of the mind. Now you might say, well, why do you need two categories for the commissives and the expressives? Because the direction of fit's the same. They're both going uphill. Promises and orders are both have the world to mind or world to word direction of fit. Why do you need two categories? One guy who was very smart suggested to me, why not think of the promise as an order you give to yourself? Or why not think of the order as a promise you impose on somebody else? I order you to leave the room. Well, that is in effect me promising for you to leave the room. Or I promise myself that I will come and see you on Wednesday. Why isn't that just an order I give to myself? Now, if you see the difference, you'll see a deep point. The difference is this. In the case of promises, you create an obligation, which you don't create in the case of an order or a request. The promise by itself creates a commitment or an obligation, and that's going to be very important when we talk about institutional reality. The whole notion of commitment as it works for human society. But you need two categories, even though they have the same direction of fit, because the speaker-based direction of fit involves a kind of commitment, namely an obligation, which the hearer-based does not. I cannot impose an obligation on you. I walk up to you on the street and I say, give me $5. You're under no obligation. But if I say to you, I promise to give you $5, then I'm under an obligation. You create an obligation by making a promise, which you do not create by giving an order or a request. Now, it's not always obvious what category an utterance fits into, and lots of utterances fit into several different categories. I once gave a lecture on language at the University of Notre Dame, as they insist on pronouncing it. I shudder when I hear that, Notre Dame, after all. But anyway, at Notre Dame, as they insist cheerfully on calling it, I gave a lecture on this, and some kid asked me, well, what about a prayer? What kind of a speech act is a prayer? And I said, a prayer is a directive. Give us this day our daily bread. Well, there was a near riot. They were confronted with the Antichrist, and they let me know it. And of course, they're absolutely right. It's not a directive. You wouldn't say, give us this day our daily bread, or else. Give us this day our daily bread, or I'll slug you. You wouldn't. Those tag things that go on with ordinary, I mean, impolite, but nonetheless they're grammatically permissible. With requests and orders and commands, you can't do that with a prayer. And the answer, of course, is that a prayer of this kind, at least, is not a request. Some prayers are requests. When Huck Finn prayed that he would catch fish, that was a directive. He was requesting God to enable him to catch the fish. But prayers of the kind that we're interested in here, give us this day our daily bread, that's not a directive. You're not ordering or requesting something of God. You are expressing your faith. Our Father who art in heaven, etc. That is an expressive. So it's not obvious always on the surface. I mean, the fact that it has in the imperative mood doesn't show that it is a directive. So, for example, if you say to somebody, have some cake or take a seat, they don't respond, don't try to boss me around, even though the sentence was in the imperative mood, because they understand that have some cake is not an order, it's an offer. It's a type of promise. An offer is a promise that is made conditional on acceptance. Okay, I've gone through this fast, and I want you to see how language maps elegantly onto the theory of intentionality. But now we're going to get to an important asymmetry where you get something in language that you do not get in pre-linguistic intentionality, and it is the key to understanding human society. It's a particular type of speech act that's not yet included. But before I go to that, let me emphasize again the complexity of the phenomena. One and the same utterance can be several different speech acts. It's late at night at a faculty party, and everybody's pretty drunk. And the wife says to the husband, it's really quite late. The husband says, no, it's only 2 a.m., it's not late at all. And she says, dear, it is really quite late. Okay, now that, in the first case, is an assertive. She is making a statement about the time at which he is objecting. But it also functions as a directive. It's time to go. Let's get the hell out of here. Furthermore, it seems to me it might be even a commissive or a threat. Wait till I get you home after your bad behavior with that assistant professor from comparative literature. And of course, it might also be an expressive. Am I fed up with you? So one and the same harmless utterance, it's really quite late, can function as at least 4 different kinds of speech acts. So I don't want you to think that everything falls neatly into one category or another. And of course, in ordinary speech, much of what we do is done indirectly. So typically, you make an order or a request by asking a question. Can you reach the salt? Can you pass the salt? In fact, as an exercise, you might think of all the ways you can ask somebody to pass the salt without saying, pass the salt. You can say, can you pass the salt? Could you pass the salt? Would you pass the salt? Would you mind passing the salt? Can you reach the salt over there? They never put enough salt on the pizza in this place. Is that the salt over there next to you, Bill? And so on. All of those will be requests to pass the salt, all of which are said without the use of the imperative mood. Does everybody see that? So there are all kinds of ways of performing a speech act indirectly. Those are called indirect speech acts. Okay, now I want everybody to understand it because I'm now going to the next absolutely crucial point. Let's take questions. You had a question.
So I get that in the case of like the wife, it's her choice when she speaks, whether it's assertive, directive, or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But what if the listener or the husband assumes that she means certain things when she does it? Does it still have the commissive or expressive element?
Well, what does he assume? You see, sometimes she may fail to communicate. That is, what speech act she performs depends on her intention or her intentions. But often people fail to grasp those intentions. People are not listening, or they're inattentive, or they don't want to hear what you really mean by what you say. So I imagine a case where she, in one utterance of a simple sentence, performed 4 different speech acts: an assertive, a directive, a commissive, and an expressive, and would normally be understood by anybody there to perform those types of speech acts. Did you complain to your husband in the court case, it is asked? Of course I did. I said it's really quite late. That was a complaint, an expressive. Did you ask him to go home? Yes, I did. I said it's really quite late. That was, and so on. So she could reasonably maintain that she had in fact performed these 4. Now, whether or not he understands them, that's up to him, but we're supposing he does. We're supposing in this case that he understood all 4 speech acts. And in normal social situations, especially with people you know well, you grasp all of these subtleties instantly. It's not a problem to get them. Yes?
Does fiction, like recitation or drama or something, fit into any?
Yes, it does, but it's a bit tricky. If you're interested in this, I teach a course on it, but I'm not advertising the course. I wrote an article called The Logical Status of Fictional Discourse, and you would probably find it online. But the important thing to see is this. In a work of fiction, typically you get assertives, but the commitment to this direction of fit is broken. You have a convention of fiction that comes in from the side and suspends the normal commitment. So if you read, once upon a time there was a little girl named Little Red Riding Hood, and every day she went out wearing her riding hood, it won't do to ask the author, well, how do you know it was really red? Maybe it just looked red in the crazy light in that dumb forest she lives in. Well, that's not an appropriate question, because he didn't actually make a statement. So the rules of the statement game, how do you know, what's your evidence, those don't apply. Now, it's tempting to think that there's some special semantic marker for fiction. There isn't. It's true that there is a type of convention that's grown up whereby in English, if you say once upon a time, it usually marks a children's story. But nowadays, you can use it ironically in nonfiction. Once upon a time, there was an innocent guy from Chicago named Barack Obama who mistakenly thought he might find happiness and fulfillment in Washington, D.C., and I'll let you write the rest of the story. So, and by the way, the once upon a time translates into other languages. Es war einmal. Sounds like you're going to say something pretty heavy duty because it's German. Il y avait une fois is the French. And what's Spanish? Hay una vez? What's the Spanish? Yeah. And I don't know Russian or Portuguese, but I'm sure they must have a locution. But those are not semantic markers for fiction. They are extra semantic conventional devices that have grown up typically surrounding fiction, but normally they don't. If you began your first novel with this expression, once upon a time, well, the editors would think, this is some pretty arch, ironic guy. You don't do that. You say, Sally, for the first time, approached a bar alone at night. You see, now you got a novel going there, you see, but not once upon a time. So, okay, here's the point. Any sentence that can occur in nonfiction can also occur in fiction. What happens in fiction is that you suspend the normal commitment of words to world. Now, there is an apparent exception to that, which is epistemic. You can use a style in fiction which is very unusual in nonfiction, and that's called style indirect libre. In fiction, you can say things like, Sally wouldn't put up with this from Jimmy. No sirree, not Sally. She had had enough. Okay, now in that part that I just said, expressions like no sirree are intended to be what Sally is thinking to herself, not what the author is thinking about Sally. So it's free indirect style in that you quote her indirectly, but it's in a free fashion. You don't have to put it in quotation mark. So with odd exceptions like this, any sentence at all that can occur in nonfiction can occur in fiction. Fiction is not a separate kind of speech act. It is a way of breaking the connection of the normal commitment of regular speech acts. I detect the restiveness of the assembled, huddled masses when they think it's time to get the hell out of here. Okay, I didn't get to the punchline. You got to come back on Thursday to find out why we went through all this stuff about language.